Hey guys, welcome to episode 8 of FNV The Cutting Room Floor, a series where we examine the cut content and development of Fallout New Vegas. And this is a very, very special episode because I recently had the chance to speak with Chris Avellone. Now, not only was Chris an integral part of Fallout New Vegas' development, but he's been involved in a long list of legendary RPGs like Fallout 2, Planescape Torment, KOTOR 2, FTL Advanced Edition, and Divinity Original Sin 2, among many others. Getting to talk with Chris has by far been the high point of the series for me, and I'm incredibly excited to share everything that we talked about. He even followed me on Twitter afterwards, which honestly left me a bit starstruck. Due to the length of our interview, I've split it into 2 separate episodes. Let's get into part 1. Now, I knew Chris's role varied during Fallout New Vegas' development, from writing characters for the core game like Cass and the Legate, to leading development on the Dead Money, Old World Blues, and Lonesome Road DLCs, and that he was even involved in some of the game's VO recordings. I also mistakenly thought he was creative lead on the core game, so to begin, I asked Chris about his role on FNV's development team. I wasn't creative lead on New Vegas. It was John Gonzalez of Shadow of Mordor and Horizon Zero Dawn. He left the company not long after Honest Hearts shipped. He did the survivor logs in Honest Hearts, which received high praise from players. I was a senior designer on New Vegas, however, so I did write some major characters, the Legate and Cass included, and random writing assignments like the lore or the in-slides as needed, plus helping out with helping organize construction for some dialogues. The game's schedule was such we couldn't always go into the studio for every recording, but I was able to go to Cass's for sure, and I did go to all the voice recording sessions for the DLCs I worked on. I was project lead on the 3 DLCs you mentioned, and I did go to the voice sessions for those. Old World Blues was perhaps the most fun recording session I've ever been involved in. Everyone had a good time because of the subject matter. It's often a mistake not to send the writers to a recording session, and even if we were pressed for time, we should have found a way to make it work with the schedule. For example, the NCR finale in the New Vegas core game is somewhat odd, in that the actor isn't speaking in a way that matches the cadence of the text, so it's a little jarring, and we weren't allowed the time to re-record it. During development of the original Fallout 3, known internally as Van Buren at Black Isle, the game was playtested in pen and paper RPG campaigns that Chris game mastered. Many of the ideas formulated for Van Buren's pen and paper campaigns were eventually recycled into FNV, and I asked Chris if he could talk about some of the content that ultimately ended up in New Vegas. It's true. A lot of the elements of New Vegas came from those pen and paper campaigns, not in particular order, but the groups like the Powder Gangers, which were fleshed out a bit more in Van Buren than they were in New Vegas, but that wasn't the area designer's fault. The Boulder Dome became the Big Mountain Dome in Old World Blues, and that DLC even used elements of the original opening movie we intended for Van Buren. The Big Mountain facility was originally a robotic boot camp in Van Buren. Caesar's Legion, although their presentation changed to mimicking the historical presentation, originally they were Mad Men-style slavers who were focused on quotas to meet demand back west by mysterious purchasers. The Hanged Man, which became Joshua Graham, especially in his look, the lore around Denver, the Twisted Hares, which was Ulysses' tribe before they were absorbed by the Legion, the Hangdogs, Denver mentions, the city in Van Buren was overrun by packs of dogs. Hoover Dam, although it was actually a town locale in Van Buren, a settlement built from all the wreckage that had piled up at the dam from upriver. The Caravan and Merchant Wars. In Van Buren, the merchant families were holding NCR's economy hostage, so NCR was getting yanked around in ways that didn't benefit the wasteland. And even some of the notable NPCs in New Vegas stem from there. Elijah from Dead Money was actually a good guy in Van Buren, who went into self-imposed exile from the Brotherhood after stripping away their ability to unlock and use their power armor, which meant the Brotherhood of Steel were getting hammered by NCR soldiers without the technological edge. And Christine from Dead Money was originally NCR and intended to be a companion in Van Buren. Lastly, the super mutant Nightkin stealth soldiers suffering psychological degradation from continued stealth boy usage came from Van Buren as well. This is a big threat in Van Buren, and could even affect super mutant characters in Van Buren if the player made a super mutant player character. There's more, but that's just a few of the elements. We had a ghoul rebellion back west, the Ghouls and Gecko, and the war between the NCR and Brotherhood had even sadder elements about it, because anyone who had played Fallout 2 would have understood what triggered the war, and the mistake in the NCR blaming the Brotherhood. They had no conception of who the Enclave was, or that any group would still have access to nukes, so they assumed it was the Brotherhood was responsible when San Francisco gets nuked by the Enclave in retaliation for the destruction of the Poseidon oil rig. Outside of video games, I'm an avid fan of tabletop role-playing games, and in my experience running them, I had an epiphany when I realized that players will always come up with solutions to problems that I never would have expected. And that when the story went off the rails in that fashion, that's when it was most interesting and dramatic. I asked Chris if his time with pen and paper RPGs influenced his philosophy on player agency in gaming. You're right, and it's one of the reasons I was so happy we did pen and paper playthroughs of Van Buren. I ran 2 groups, partly so I could get more eyes on the rules and locations from the players and cover more of the world, but also so I could see how 2 groups of player characters could react in the same section of the game world, which I wanted as a pillar for Van Buren, and see what they do when rumors and consequences of the other group's actions came to their attention. I definitely found the experience helpful. As you said, players would often have better and/or unexpected ideas for quest solutions and direction than the original concepts, and the ability to play it through rhythm in the pen and paper setting was great. It was like using the pen and paper sessions as sounding boards for area and system designs. I took copious notes on how players reacted, what ways they thought to solve the quest, then added them to the design docs, and also filled in areas that worked and areas that didn't. Was there a place where they gravitated toward that didn't provide enough info or provide enough of a satisfactory conclusion to their question? If so, I recorded it and fixed it. I almost wish every RPG had the chance to play through its campaign in pen and paper, but it's such a hard thing to keep going while you're doing game development that I still consider Van Buren a rare opportunity to pursue it, because we couldn't do much more than run the pen and paper sessions with only me working on it. Thus, paper or pen and paper prototyping was the way to go. Chris created many of the concepts used in Fallout New Vegas during his time on Van Buren before it was ultimately canceled. While many of these concepts were recycled for FNV, his ideas were morphed into something significantly different by other developers over the years. I asked Chris about this, and he replied, "It happens, and it's a good thing, as I've learned from comics. If new creators didn't take the old concepts and put their spin on them, the core concepts would get, well, stale, and we'd lose what a fresh perspective brings. The only issue with Van Buren is that no one ever experienced the concepts aside from the pen and paper gaming group, most of whom weren't at Obsidian at all, so the mutations went on without those original perspectives in place, and sometimes didn't seem to recognize the original concept as to what had caused those ideas to come into being in the first place. In general, I thought some of the new spins were cool, but some of the other concepts ended up being duller as a result, no biased, mine included, because of where the New Vegas game was placed. This made a lot of the thrust of the characters and factions weaker because of the distance from the West Coast, and the ones that could be more immediate, like the danger of the Legion if they were slavers and selling humans to super mutants so they could dunk them in a newfound vat of FEV, for example, or something closer to NCR proper, so you can see the Brotherhood and NCR war playing out and become a part of it. FNV has a lot of unused content, but none of it is quite as interesting to me as Ulysses' original incarnation. Of all the questions I had, these were some of the most exciting for me as a fan. Chris mentioned in a previous interview that even though Ulysses was recycled as the antagonist of Lonesome Road, that version of the character was entirely different than his original vision. I inquired about this further, and he responded, "While the mechanics of his presentation changed, his actual approach didn't change much. The biggest advantage, had he made it into the core game, was the perspective and the light he could have shed on the Legion as a faction. However, even though not a fan favorite by any means, I did prefer Ulysses' integration into the DLC structure, as I thought it gave an overarching arc to the DLCs and a sense that they were leading to something, even if some players found it disappointing, and granted, we did run out of resources towards the end, especially when the Microsoft layoffs happened very suddenly when Stormlands was cancelled. We didn't have a backup plan in place to deal with it, so it caused a lot of problems in the development cycles for the surviving projects. For those of you who are unaware, Stormlands was an MMO RPG developed by Obsidian that was planned to be an early launch title for the Xbox One prior to its cancellation in 2012. As a result, over 30 Obsidian employees were laid off, affecting many members of New Vegas' development team. This included tech producer Jason Fader, world builder Denise McMurray, lead programmer Frank Kowalkowski, junior designer Casey Kwok, junior environmental artist Roger Chang, and designer Robert Lee. When I spoke with Jason Bergman and J.R. Vosvic, both of them recounted at the exceptional length of Ulysses' original script, with J.R. mentioning that it was over 10,000 lines. Ever since, I've been even more fascinated about how much lore his character would have spouted about the world. I asked Chris if he could talk about the original version of Ulysses. I don't recall it being over 10,000 lines, unless there were some broken or unnecessary stub strings, but it's possible. I don't have the word dumps to reference, so I don't truly know. He would have provided more backstory on Caesar's march west, more perspective on Caesar, although he already does this some in Lonesome Road, and would have been able to speak personally about what it meant to be part of a tribe, and then be absorbed by something like the Legion. The presentation probably would have been better had he been a companion, though. In our look at the Legion's cut content, I talked about how Ulysses was originally planned to appear in the core game at Wolfhorn Ranch, as well as the 4 Legion NPCs who were meant to appear there alongside him, who I speculated were his bodyguards. I also mentioned the unused SIP marker that revealed Ulysses would have been sitting on top of a grave. I asked Chris if he remembered anything about Ulysses' content before it was left on the cutting room floor. If I recall correctly, they weren't bodyguards, they were Legion soldiers he either had to kill or had just buried. I don't have access to the game files expressly or my notes, else I'd be happy to share with you. Before this, we could only speculate who was intended to be buried in the grave, and I found his reply particularly interesting. Unfortunately, it appears that many aspects of Ulysses' implementation as a companion will always remain one of New Vegas' greatest mysteries. I thought Caesar and Wolpus and Colta were amazing, and the Legion's concept interesting, but found their actual execution to be one of FNV's weakest aspects. The other factions have a certain moral ambiguity that you never really experienced with the Legion. I asked Chris what changes or additions he thought would have strengthened the faction. I agree. The Legion had an unbalanced presentation compared to the other factions, and while Caesar himself is interesting and very iconic in a very Fallout way, kudos to John Gonzalez, ultimately, I don't think the Legion sold itself well as being an interesting faction to join, or a faction you'd even want to join. The misogyny alone was a big red no for me, and it always bothered me in their design. The fundamental issue is that in a game about wanting to join and experience the range of interactions with faction mechanics, which was one of the big design elements of New Vegas, it was the narrative of the faction that limited people from wanting to engage with the mechanics by joining that faction. As a result, both its negative presentation and its unbalanced presentation worked together to reduce and limit choice. This was also coupled by the fact that it was very easy to break faction joining quest, so often players fell through to the anarchist path. Note that I'm fine with an anarchist path. I think players should be the one carving their philosophy on the wasteland if they want. Part of the positives for having Ulysses as a companion in the core game was that at least he could give a mouthpiece to the Legion perspective, similar to what Cass does reluctantly, but he can give even more information. I think Wolpus would have been much better, but it was decided that no companion would be intricately tied to the main plot, which I think was a huge mistake. Yes Man, Benny, Wolpus, and more could have been great companions in my opinion.
I'm gonna get some extra ammo, a few bottles of whiskey, and then show them how Cassidy's settle accounts.
Cass is one of my favorite companions in New Vegas. Her voice acting is some of the best in the game in my opinion, and her quest Heartache by the Number is incredible. So I had several questions I wanted to ask Chris about Rose of Sharon Cassidy. First, I asked about her hair color change. Her collector's edition card depicts her as a blonde, but clearly this was changed at some point in development. I'm glad you liked her. To address her questions, I'm not sure when her hair color changed, if at all. It may have been a miscommunication with the people making the cards. Cass has a ridiculous number of unused reactivity lines and empty dialogue topics, easily more than any other companion. So I asked Chris if Cass appeared as he intended, or if his original vision was grander. Her narrative and quest presentation wasn't necessarily grander, it was just more reactive. For example, the voice actress Rachel Roswell recorded the lines for when you're wandering Freeside and people are catcalling Cass, and Cass specifically responds to each one and shuts them down, which was fun. As Chris mentioned, Cass has around 20 recorded lines for shutting down various residents of Freeside. Now, I believe it's technically possible to hear some of these lines in an unmodded game, but I've had difficulty triggering them. I'm not sure if this is related to patch 1.4, which made Cass much less talkative, but I'll include some of the lines here for those of you who haven't heard them.
Got enough on my shoulders without adding more dead weight to them. Not interested in any weapon that shoots blanks. If you're looking for action, grab some grease from your hair and give your gun a few pulls. Stake a claim somewhere else, pretty boy. No, and I ain't looking to be a babysitter neither. A drink wouldn't make you any prettier, Slick. Ain't nothing but a hound dog. If you're looking for action, jam your dick in a locker and slam it a few times.
Well now, ain't seen you around before, stranger. Name's Cassidy. I run this place. What can I do for you?
Another reason I love Cass as a companion is that she's the daughter of John Cassidy, who's one of my favorite companions from Fallout 2. Both of them even share a line of dialogue, which I think is brilliant.
Sure could use a drink.
I asked Chris about the idea of including a direct descendant of a previous companion. The idea of including a descendant of John Cassidy was given by our project director. Many of the companions at the time were written as one-pages and then passed off to individual designers, which can limit your creativity somewhat. Ulysses wasn't, which was part of the reason I was more inspired to work on him, and it was also a reason we rebelled against one-pagers in Pillars 2. Writing a companion is fun, but it's less fun when someone designs it for you. That said, Cass having a nod to one of the companions in Fallout 2 seemed a nice way to tie the two titles together, even in a small way.
As for Dad, I figure he just got himself lost or dead. Happens. And I'm not all boo-hoo about it, so save your glass for someone who's crying.
Chris once mentioned that he specifically left John Cassidy's fate unknown in Cass's dialogue. I asked what his reasoning was behind leaving John Cassidy's fate ambiguous. So in the many words of wisdom related to me in conversation with Fallout 1's project director, Tim Kane, he explained to me that they purposely chose not to answer certain questions in Fallout 1 because it would put design, narrative, and perhaps even the franchise itself in a corner. And it would do it unnecessarily, since having the answers wouldn't impact Fallout 1's gameplay experience at all. He called it leaving wiggle room. I know how super serious it sounds, using those tough words, but it's the harsh way Tim Kane speaks. But he's absolutely right. Sometimes too many answers, too much detail, can put limiters on a franchise that it can't escape from, and close it off to other narrative possibilities. And doing retcons can get messy. For me, answering what happened to John Cassidy wasn't something I thought would be a positive. I thought there might be future narrative fuel there. It turns out there wasn't. I was gauging fan reaction and no one gave two shits, so I let it lie. But I didn't want to close it off entirely, so I included the necklace memento, the suggestion he might be lost out in the wasteland, and left it at that because it could serve as future narrative or franchise fuel. After all, what if John Cassidy found something horrible in the huge twisters blanketing Texas? Or worse, woke up something terrible. For narrative designers, unfortunately, we love shit like that, and leaving such questions to potentially answer for the future if we'd like. And that's all for part 1 of our interview. As always, thanks for watching, and like and subscribe for more content like this.